My son punched me in the middle of his own wedding. Not in some hidden corner, not behind a closed door, but in front of 300 guests, right in the middle of a banquet hall, worth millions of dollars. His fist connected with my face so hard I crashed backward into a display of white orchids, blood flooding my mouth. And what I will never forget is not the pain. It's what happened immediately after. 300 people went dead silent. Champagne glasses froze in midair. The orchestra stopped playing. Not a single person said a word. They all just stood there watching a 63-year-old veteran stagger on the marble floor, as if he were the one who deserved to be punished. I lifted my head. Standing across from me was Brandon, my son. What nearly broke me completely was the look in his eyes. Not one trace of regret. Nothing but contempt, cold and absolute. He calmly straightened his vest with one hand and used the other to point directly at me. "Remove him," he said. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the reason he hit me, and the truth that every single person in that room was about to discover just minutes later. My name is Raymond Torres. I'm 63 years old, a retired Army Master Sergeant, and until 6 months ago I believed the hardest thing I had ever faced happened in the Kunar province of Afghanistan in April of 2004. I was wrong about that. What happened at my son Brandon's wedding at the Palomino Grand in uptown Dallas was harder. Not because it hurt more than combat, but because I didn't see it coming from the one direction I had never thought to guard. I want you to know that I almost didn't wear the uniform. I stood in my hotel room that morning with my dress blues on their hanger and the simple black suit hanging beside them, and I held both possibilities in my hands for a long time. I knew Brandon. I knew how he looked at certain things, at anything that reminded his guests that he came from somewhere modest. I had seen him reroute conversations away from me at his company events with a skill that honestly impressed me, and I thought about doing him that favor, tucking the uniform away, making myself easier. I put it on anyway, because those medals are not decoration. The Distinguished Service Medal with Valor, the Purple Heart, the Combat Action Ribbon. They are not metal. They are decisions, 30 years of them. They are the weight of men I carried, and couldn't save, and refused to leave behind. They are Tommy Castellano's name on a wall in Washington that most of Brandon's guests will never visit. If there was one morning I was allowed to arrive as myself, I thought, surely it was the morning my son got married. I walked into that ballroom proud of him. I want you to hold on to that. Whatever came after, I walked in proud. He found me near the bar. His voice reached me before his face did, that clipped executive tone he'd developed in his late 20s that I never quite recognized as his. "Dad, what is that?" Not a question. A verdict. He was already close when I turned close enough for me to see how tight his jaw was, how his eyes moved from my face to my chest like he was cataloging something that needed to be removed. Courtney was one step behind him, her expression sealed. "My dress uniform, son," I said. "I wore it to your sister's college graduation. I wore it when they promoted me to. You wore it to embarrass me." He stepped closer. "Look around this room. These are not base housing people, Dad. These are investors, board members, city council. I have spent a decade building toward tonight, and you walked in here dressed like an exhibit. Like a soldier," I said. He laughed, one syllable, cold as a closed door. I thought about a Tuesday in 2003 when Brandon was 15 and I'd been home for 11 days after 14 months away. We were eating breakfast and he asked me, without looking up from his cereal, whether I was leaving again soon, not accusatory. Just asking. The way you ask about weather, something you have no control over but need to know about. I told him 3 weeks. He nodded, finished his cereal, put the bowl in the sink and went to school. I sat at that table for a long time thinking about what it meant that my son had learned to absorb my absence the way some children learn to absorb chronic pain, efficiently, without complaint, without anyone to blame. I had told myself that was resilience. Now I wondered whether it had been something lonelier. "Brandon," I said quietly, steadily, the way I had learned to speak in situations where steadiness was the only remaining tool. "These medals are not a costume. Every piece of metal on this chest is a moment that cannot be undone. The Distinguished Service Medal with Valor is from an ambush in Kunar province, where I made choices that I still hear in my sleep. The Purple Heart is from the shrapnel that went through my shoulder in the same operation. You grew up in a stable house because of these. You had what you had because you were never there," he said. And there it was, the real thing underneath everything. I want to tell you honestly. I want to be honest with you that in that moment I understood him. Even in the middle of my own pain I understood him, because I had spent 30 years understanding him from a distance, the way you understand the weather from inside a sealed vehicle. But understanding someone is not the same as accepting what they do next. Brandon. Courtney touched his arm. Baby, maybe this isn't... No. He shook her off. His voice had risen. The conversations nearest to us had gone quiet. This ends here. Take them off, Dad. Take the medals off, or I'm having you escorted out of my wedding. He hadn't raised his hand yet. That came 3 seconds later, after I looked him in the eye and said, with complete calm, No. No. It was the quietest word I'd spoken all evening, and it broke something open in him. His fist connected with the left side of my jaw. I went back into the cocktail table flowers, a glass, a small spray of champagne, and caught myself on the edge of it. The sound carried across the ballroom like something dropped in a cathedral. Sharp, final. Then silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Someone screamed near the back of the room. Someone else said something I couldn't make out. Brandon was already straightening his jacket, breathing hard, already performing recovery for an audience he hadn't stopped performing for all evening. I held my jaw, tasted blood on the inside of my cheek, thought, for one strange and sideways second, about Tommy Castellano, about whether this was what dying felt like to him. Small and sideways and without enough warning. That was when a hand came down on Brandon's shoulder. Not gentle. The grip of a man who had trained for situations where things needed to stop. Nobody. The voice was quiet. It didn't need to be loud. Nobody touches that man. Thomas Hargrove was not someone you missed in a room. 55 years old, charcoal suit, gray-flecked hair cut close, the kind of stillness in his body that comes from having spent years in places where unnecessary movement gets people killed. I had seen him at Brandon's company events over the years. An investor, a mentor. Brandon had called him once, casually, in a way that suggested he had no idea the word had weight. We had never been introduced. Hargrove had Brandon's wrist now in a grip my son could not undo. His eyes found mine over Brandon's shoulder, and something passed across his face, not just recognition. Relief. The particular relief of a man who has been waiting a long time for a moment to arrive. You're going to want to hear this, he said. Not to me. To everyone. The room had gone cathedral quiet again. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that 300 people understood, before a single word had been spoken, that whatever was about to happen would change something. The air had that specific quality the way a room feels just before a storm hits, charged and expectant and very, very still. Hargrove released Brandon's wrist. He didn't step back. Chief Torres, he said, turning to me, I owe you an introduction that is about 20 years overdue. I hadn't heard my rank in 9 years. Not like that, not from someone who said it the way it was meant to be said, as a designation earned rather than a title worn. It landed somewhere in my chest with a weight I hadn't expected. Do you know who my father is? Brandon's voice cracked slightly on the words. Not from emotion, from uncertainty. He was genuinely asking. Your father, Hargrove said, turning back to Brandon with an expression so controlled it was frightening, is the reason I am standing in this room tonight. The reason I have a company. The reason I have a heartbeat. Honestly, I want to tell you what I felt in that moment. I felt nothing. Not vindication. Not relief. A kind of hollow suspension, like the 3 seconds between lightning and thunder when you don't know yet how far away the storm is. I had spent 30 years not talking about Afghanistan. I had made a deliberate practice of not talking about it, especially to Brandon, especially because I never wanted my service to feel like a claim I was staking on his gratitude. I wanted him to love me for the man at the breakfast table, not for the man in the valley. I was about to find out that the valley had been following both of us for 20 years without either of us knowing it. Kunar Province, said Hargrove. April 14th, 2004. His voice settled into the measured cadence of a man who had given this account before in deposition rooms, in therapy offices, in the dark before dawn when the memories arrived uninvited. A joint operation. 12 vehicles. 28 men total. Supposed to be a straightforward transit-run humanitarian supplies to a village cut off by seasonal flooding. 40 minutes out, 40 minutes back. The intelligence was wrong. I closed my eyes and the smell came back before anything else. Dust and diesel and the particular dryness of high-altitude air. The weight of kit on my back. The sound of the first RPG detonating against the lead vehicle, and the way the world sorted itself, in roughly 4 seconds, into the category of things that were about to kill us, and the category of things that might not. 28 men, said Hargrove, caught in a canyon approach, no cover except a depression in the road that we were already in. I took a round through the lower leg within the first 2 minutes, and went down behind a vehicle that was already burning. The man beside me had a tourniquet on his arm, and was unconscious. Our radio operator was dead. We had no way to call for extraction. We were going to die in that canyon in alphabetical order. I want you to feel that ballroom with me for a moment. Feel the chandeliers, the white orchids, the smell of catered food and expensive perfume. 300 people in formal wear, listening to a man describe the particular mathematics of impending death, the way you count bodies and ammunition and time remaining, and understand, without drama, that the numbers don't favor you. Feel how far away those two worlds were from each other, and feel that Ray Torres had walked across the distance between them every single morning for 20 years without asking anyone to notice. Your father's unit, said Hargrove, was not assigned to our sector. They were conducting a separate operation 3 kilometers north, and the terrain between us should have made contact impossible. But Chief Torres heard the ambush. He heard it. And he made a decision not ordered, not authorized, purely his own to redirect his team toward the sound of it. Someone in the back of the ballroom was crying. I could hear it, but I couldn't look away from my son's face. Brandon was staring at Hargrove like a man who has stepped into a room and found that all the furniture has been rearranged in the dark. He was trying to find the familiar shapes of things. He couldn't. He flanked the ambush from a ridgeline the enemy wasn't watching, said Hargrove. 12 minutes of sustained contact. In those 12 minutes, your father personally carried 2 men under fire, with no cover, across ground that was being actively targeted to a position where they could be stabilized. One of those men was me. Brandon's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I had a sucking chest wound and a shattered leg, Hargrove continued. I was not conscious in any meaningful sense. What I knew was pain and cold and a voice. Your father's voice. He had his hands on my chest wound, keeping pressure, keeping the air in, and he was talking, telling me about his son, about how his son had just gotten into his first-choice university, about how proud he was, how smart the kid was, how this kid was going to build something real. The room swam a little. I touched the edge of a nearby table. I spent 40 minutes listening to Raymond Torres describe his son, said Hargrove, while I was deciding whether to stay alive or stop trying. And I chose to stay, partly because I was stubborn, partly because the medics eventually reached us, but partly because this man made his son sound worth staying alive for. Silence. Pur, immense silence. When I inherited my company from my grandfather 3 years later, Hargrove said, his voice dropping, I had a choice. I could spend the rest of my life being the man who survived, or the man who made the survival mean something. I chose the second option. And I thought about the son Ray Torres had described in that valley. The smart kid. The kid who was going to build something. He turned to Brandon. The Harbor District contract that launched Torres Capital Partners. I placed that referral, the Meridian Group investment round. I made 4 calls. The city council relationships that cleared your Lakewood development approval. Those went through my office. For 6 years, Brandon, I have been the invisible ground beneath every foundation you thought you built alone. Brandon sat down, not gracefully. His legs simply stopped holding him, and he landed in a chair behind him, his head in his hands. Courtney had not moved in several minutes. The guests nearest to us had formed a loose, horrified circle, and beyond them the word was spreading in waves through the ballroom. I could see it in the way faces changed as the information reached them. I want to be honest with you about what I felt. Not triumph, not satisfaction. I felt something I can only describe as grief. For the version of this evening I had imagined the version where I sat in the 3rd row and watched my son marry someone he loved, and drove back to my apartment in Garland with my heart full. I grieved that version. And then I let it go. Son, I said. I walked toward Brandon and crouched in front of the chair so we were at eye level. He looked up, and for the first time in years I saw the boy at the breakfast table, the one who asked me, without looking up, whether I was leaving again soon. I never wanted you to feel like you owed me anything, not one thing. I kept quiet about the service because I wanted you to love me for the man who sat across from you, not for what I did when you weren't watching. Why didn't you tell me, he said. His voice was destroyed. "Because I was afraid," I said, "that if I told you, and you still weren't proud of me, I wouldn't know what to do with that. And I loved you too much to find out." That broke him completely. Good, I think it needed to. Hargrove handled the rest. He had legal on the phone before Brandon's wedding cake was cut. The restructuring of Torres Capital Partners into Hargrove Industries was announced Monday morning. 432 employees retained, benefits honored. Brandon offered a position, not executive, not leadership, entry-level management with a salary that required him to actually track his expenses for the first time in his adult life. He took it. Courtney filed 3 weeks after the wedding. I don't say that with satisfaction either. I say it because it happened, and because I think it was honest, and sometimes the most merciful thing a situation can do is be honest quickly. 6 months later, I am sitting on the back porch of a small house outside Garland with a cup of coffee, watching the sun come up over a row of post oaks, and I mean this in the most unperformative way possible, at peace. Thomas Hargrove bought me this house over my objections, and called it compensation for decades of unacknowledged valor, and told me I had never learned to receive anything gracefully, and that this was my one flaw. He wasn't wrong. We have dinner on Tuesdays. We drive out to the lake on weekends. We talk about Afghanistan without it destroying us, which is something I didn't think I would ever be able to do, and it turns out the difference between a wound and a scar is just enough time and the right person willing to hold the history with you. Brandon texts me, carefully, irregularly, like someone practicing a language they are not yet fluent in. Last month he sent a picture of his first performance review. It said he was meeting expectations. He wrote, "I know that doesn't sound like much, but I earned it." I wrote back, "That's everything, son. We haven't had dinner yet. There is a conversation ahead of us that I am not rushing toward. But something is growing in the space between us that is more honest than what came before. Not forgiveness yet, not reconciliation, but the beginning of two people deciding to know each other without pretense. What this story has taught me, and I'll say it plainly because I think you came here for something true, is that the lie I lived for 30 years was this, that making myself smaller would make me easier to love. I swallowed my history. I edited myself into something I thought was more comfortable to be around, and somewhere in that process I modeled, for my son, a version of his father that was apologetic for taking up space. I wonder sometimes how much of what he believed about me I accidentally taught him. I wonder if the contempt started as confusion, a child trying to understand why the man he was supposed to look up to kept looking down. The mistake most people in my position make is believing that patience is the same as acceptance. I was patient with Brandon's indifference for 30 years. But patience without honesty is just postponed pain. If I could go back and change one thing, it wouldn't be the uniform I wore to his wedding. It would be the conversation I never had, the one where I sat him down and told him the truth about who I was and what I had done and what it had cost and what I had chosen to give anyway, freely, without obligation. I'll leave you with this question, and I mean it sincerely. Who have you made yourself smaller for, and did it work? Did the smallness earn you what you were hoping it would? Because if the answer is no, and I suspect for many of you it is, then perhaps the bravest thing you can do today is let yourself be seen. Not perfectly, not in a way that anyone else gets to approve. Just seen. Drop a 1 in the comments if you think Ray should push harder toward reconciliation. Drop a 2 if you think he was right to let Brandon earn his own way back. Drop a 3 if something in this story found you somewhere personal, somewhere you weren't expecting. I read every comment. Every single one. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I love knowing how far these stories reach. If this one found you at the right moment, please consider subscribing. It means more than I can put into words. I'll keep telling stories that are worth your time. I promise. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined, set in Dallas, Texas, to create entirely original content. Any resemblance to real people, living or deceased, or to actual events is entirely coincidental.